All right, let's do it. So, hi everyone. My name is Will Zhang, and I'm the Assistant Director of the International Global Studies Program here at UNC Greensboro. And it is my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this talk entitled The CIA at 75, Untreated Analysis or Dangerous Tool, with former CIA analyst Ray McGovern. So I'm going to try and keep this introduction really short and leave as much room as possible for Ray. So just a little bit about Mr. McGovern. He served as a CIA analyst for 27 years, from the Kennedy to H.W. Bush administrations. At CIA, Mr. McGovern led the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch and conducted the Morning President's Daily Brief from 1981 to 1985. After retiring from the CIA, Ray co-founded a group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity just 2 months before the US invasion of Iraq, in order to oppose the fraudulent intelligence manufactured to justify that war. Mr. McGovern is going to speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A session. If you have questions that you think of during the talk, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and in the chat, excuse me, and I can bring them up in the Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. McGovern.
Thanks, Will. Can you hear me okay? You can, okay. Well, it's a delight to be with you. I was just a little bit older than most of you when President Kennedy gave that wonderful speech where he said, look, don't ask what your country can do for you. Ask what you might be able to do for your country. For me, it was pretty simple. I had majored in Russian. I was pretty fluent in Russian at the time. I had actually begun to teach it. And the Russians were causing quite a stir in the world back in 1961, 1962. So it was a real natural. When I read and when I studied in graduate school, that there was this new agency being formed, which the primary task of which would be to collate and gather all the information available on a certain subject or a certain issue, and that person in receipt of that information would be responsible, accountable for analyzing it and reporting it. To whom? To the President of the United States, okay? That's how Truman, who set up the CIA, wanted it. He didn't want the CIA to be under the Pentagon because he knew that the Pentagon would always say that the Russians were 10 feet tall. He knew they weren't quite that tall, okay? He didn't want us under the State Department because the State Department was always defending its own policies. They had to be working, right? So he wanted us to report directly to him, and that sounded like a great idea. Now, this book that we were given to read talked about the other side of CIA, but not very much. It was the covert action side. And what they did was, well, as you know from your own syllabus, they overthrew governments. Now, how did that all happen? Well, Truman didn't intend this. Picture this. After the war, these very, very brave, very enterprising and imaginative covert action people came back. They said, you know, we defeated the Germans. You want us to hang around? Or do you have some work for us? And the answer was, oh, no, hang around, because, you know, the Russians are the problem now. And we need people like you who can, you know, overthrow governments and, you know, jump in behind enemy lines. I do not, you know, denigrate this. This is great work during a war like World War II. For peacetime, it's a little different. Anyhow, they were going to be asked to stay and not go back to their law firms or their companies or their corporations or back to teaching. Stay around, we need you. Now, where are you going to put these guys? You can't really have a agency for overthrowing governments. It just didn't sound too good, you know. Even agency for regime change, which is the nice way to say it these days, as you gotta know. So somebody said, I got an idea. We're creating the Central Intelligence Agency. That's gonna be a real secret because they are gonna have some people collecting information from spies, let's put the covert action people in with all these analysts, and there'll be one happy family. And guess what? It was a structural fault from the beginning. The two shouldn't be together. There was an attempt to keep us separate, and this was a felicitous attempt. There was turnstiles in each floor of headquarters building. The analysts couldn't go to where the covert operators were, and vice versa. You had to have a special badge to go. They had to be pretty high muckety muck, as my Irish grandmother would say, right? So the idea was that analysis can really be tainted if you're rooting for the operators, okay? And if you're in with the operators, well, when you see a covert operation doesn't make any sense, or it's going to be harmful to U.S. interests, you know, you're going to want to say that, and you're not going to be able to say it if the guy doing the operation is in the next desk. That unfortunately is the way it is now. They're all smush together. Anyhow, I was really interested in joining this agency. So the Army put my call to active duty off for a year, and I was to report to Fort Benning, Georgia, to the Army Infantry School there as a second lieutenant to work with some of the weapons that we used. And guess what? I was to report on November 3, 1962. What's the big deal? Well, there weren't any weapons there. We thought really strange. We were, some of us were gung ho. There was a new weapon called a grenade launcher, right? To work out with that. Well, there weren't any there. So we finally asked one of the sergeants. He said, "Oh yeah, well, a division came through here 2 weeks ago, took all our weapons and most of our people. They're down in Key West now, ready to jump into Cuba." It was the Cuban Missile Crisis, exactly 60 years ago. As a matter of fact, today and tomorrow are the times when John Kennedy made a proposal to Khrushchev. He accepted it, and he withdrew the missiles from Cuba in return for a pledge not to invade on the part of the US. And that was the end of a nuclear confrontation, the likes of which we have never seen until now. I just wrote a piece today comparing the Cuban Missile Crisis with the crisis in Ukraine right now. There are distinct similarities. Somebody's got to back down because the other party feels an existential threat. Kennedy felt an existential threat. Did he take steps that were illegal? Yeah. Blockade, preparing an invasion, threatening nuclear war, sort of against the UN Charter at least. Right? Now, Putin has reacted in a similar way, but people don't know why. They just think he's a really evil, really terrible guy. And there's a reason to his madness, if you will. And I go into this little article. It'll be on Anti-War at Midnight tonight. It's sort of a digression. What else did I want to say about these? Well, it's important to realize that there evolved two CIAs, the operations people and the analysts. Now, before I forget to say this, the operations people were pretty much under the control of other operatives. Why is it that the CIA and the FBI are unwilling to release the documents having to do with John Kennedy's assassination? I think I know why. Kind of, it's a no-brainer. So, circumstantial evidence, of course. Truman himself wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, this is not what I intended for the Central Intelligence Agency. I wanted them to give the untreated intelligence, not tainted by policy considerations, not tainted by a wish to build more weapons like the Pentagon would do, untainted. And instead, they give me a bunch of operatives, and he all but suggested that this is exactly what happened exactly 1 month previous in November of 1963. And you ought to see that. Now, what's curious about that Washington Post editorial? It was really an op-ed. Well, we know how it was put together because we have Truman's notes from his office. What happened to it? Well, actually, there were 3 editions of the Washington Post in those days. It dropped off. It dropped out of the second 2 editions. Was it picked up by any other newspaper? No, it wasn't. Huh. Well, the Independence paper out there in Missouri posted it or printed it, I guess, in those days. But that gives you a little hint about how much under the thumb of the government, or under what a lot of people refer to consciously and not very far off the mark as the deep state, of which the CIA and the FBI are prime characters. So let's leave the 2 CIAs for a second. I was able to apply my trade as a Soviet analyst with freedom. In those days, the Soviet Union was pretty, it was the main enemy. And we were able to figure out what was going on, largely, mind you, by reading open sources. It's a canard to suggest that we couldn't do our job without spies in the Kremlin. Don't let this leave this room, okay? There weren't any. We could make cogent conclusions based on what the media said, media in the Soviet Union, media elsewhere, and we still do. Matter of fact, here's a little vignette. Bill Casey, who came in to head up the CIA under Ronald Reagan, was distraught. He reported at the first cabinet meeting that he couldn't believe it. He found out that his Russian analysts, they were depending on open sources, newspapers, magazines, for 80% of their source material on Russia. Well, Mr. Casey, that's all we had, really. We didn't get much from spies. Sometimes we'd get an aerial photograph. Sometimes we'd get an intercept. But most often, those would simply confirm conclusions that we had long since come to based on open sources. So that's one thing to remember. When people go to the agency and say, well, who's this McGovern guy? What's he? And they say, well, he's an old guy. That's true. And then they say, he doesn't have any classified information. That's true too, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You can figure it out all by yourself. And we have a pretty good record of having done that. My colleagues and veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity and I are very proud of our record, starting before the attack on Iraq, where we warned President Bush that this would be a catastrophe, completely unnecessary and completely illegal and just plain wrong. So what else? One of my favorite parts was when I became chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch. That was in early 1972. We were starting to negotiate with the Russians on what was called the SALT agreements, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, okay? And it was very interesting because my portfolio was Sino-Soviet relations, relations between China and Russia. And in those days, they hated each other. And we could prove it, A lot of the troglodytes in Washington, you're being taken in there. They're both commies. They're both commies. And then I tell you a little vignette here. At one point, photography over China showed rather advanced MiGs, MiG-19s, mind you, on an apron outside the Shenyang in China airframe plant. Well, the troglodytes besieged us and said, yeah, you think that they hate each other, right? What's old MiG-19 doing on the apron of that factory? Obviously, the Russians gave them their most sophisticated fighter. And we said, well, that's an airframe factory, right? Yeah. Maybe the Chinese maybe they're making them themselves. Well, 3 years later, we get this Chinese refugee, you know, and he comes in and he's in a defector reception center. We say, "Oh, you're from Shenyang." Yeah, okay. "Oh, you worked in that airframe plant." Yeah. Well, what can you tell us about it? We were told by the experts that you couldn't possibly be producing anything because there was snow on the roof. And he says, "Oh," he says, "you mean, oh, well, the idea was if there's snow in the roof, of course, the snow would melt with the production facility, the heat and all." And so this guy says, "Well, I see. We all wore 5 overcoats. We froze. That's what we produced those big dainties, one after the other." So sometimes you don't get immediate satisfaction on that one we did. Now, what else? Well, this is the highlight of my career. Well, 2 highlights, really. Having purview over the Soviet foreign policy branch, I had really a wonderful branch, about 12, 15 people, many of them with PhDs in Russian history. I seconded 3 of them, one to the SALT talks, strategic arms limitation talks, one to the military specialists that were working on these military aspects of it, and one to the headquarters unit that would be report to the director and other people here in Washington. And then, wonder of wonders, we were asked by Kissinger and Nixon, "Do you think the Russians are serious?" And we said, "Yeah, they are." "How do you know?" "Well, with all due respect, sir, you're largely responsible for that." "What do you mean?" Well, we told Kissinger, he said, "Look, your opening to China has frightened the Russians. They're not going to let China sort of beat them in cultivating relations with you. And we've seen flexibility on key issues like Berlin, 4-power agreement on Berlin. And we think not only are they ready to do a deal on strategic arms, but that part of the motivation is to prevent the Chinese from stealing a march on them. So that's how we analyze it. Well, that was the one time, maybe there was, that's the one time we really remember that we were saying, in effect, "Way to go, you're doing it," you know? Usually we were at loggerheads with Kissinger and all the other people taking a different view. Well, long story short, I'm one of those people that ducked under desks when Russia got the atom bomb in elementary school to protect me from blast and radiation. Lots of luck, you know? But it had an effect on me. I used to walk in New York City where I was born, and I look at these buildings. Somebody built a new building. I said, don't they realize that one missile will destroy this whole city? So it was a personal thing for me to be in Moscow for the signing of this treaty, the treaty on anti-ballistic missiles. It was pretty simple, you know. We were building offensive missiles. We were building defensive missiles. We're running out of money. So are the Soviets. Somebody said, hey, there's got to be a simple solution here. Let's have a MAD situation, a massive assured destruction, okay? Let's limit the deployment of anti-ballistic missiles to maybe 2 sites. So no one could possibly think that they could launch a ICBM or other strategic missile launch on the other country without suffering severe retaliation in return. So the deal was set. Kissinger and Nixon said, well, now, okay, you tell us that the Russians are interested. That's good to know. Are they going to cheat? And we said, probably. How soon can you tell us that they're cheating? Well, we went back to the experts that run the satellites and all that stuff. We came back about 10 days. 10 days. You sure? Yeah, we're pretty sure. Okay, we'll go ahead. This is the first doveraj, no proveraj. Trust, but verify. Okay, well, it wasn't Reagan. It was Reagan later, but it was Nixon and Kissinger. Well, guess what? The treaty went into effect. I came home from Moscow just feeling wonderful about the whole thing. And did the Russians cheat? Of course they cheated. They cheated. We found out they cheated about a year later. They put up a big radar in a place called Krasnoyarsk, way in the middle of Siberia. It could only be an ABM treaty. And Ronald Reagan, to his credit, called him on it. He said, "You guys go over there and show them the pictures." We showed them pictures. No, that's not an ABM radar. Well, it took 6 years of negotiations. This is the way we used to do things, folks. We used to talk to the Russians, have this all out. And after 6 years, when George H.W. Bush came into the presidency, Gorbachev said, "All right, you're right. All right, it's an ABM radar. We're going to tear it down." And they tore it down. And again, that's the first thing they tore down before the Berlin Wall. So that was really, really, really special assignment, being involved in the ABM talks and then the verification of the agreement. I want to say a word about Vietnam. Vietnam was an awful thing. People who had experience in Vietnam knew that it was a civil war, knew that the French had lost, that this was a national liberation struggle that happened to be communist, but it was a civil war, and that the North Vietnamese had been cheated out of fair elections so that they could be determined whether they would join the South or vice versa. So not many of us knew that. I was a Soviet specialist. I didn't really know much of that, but we could see that thing was going really south, going real south quick. And we began to ask questions. And a good friend of mine who came into the agency the same day I did, his name was Sam Adams. And he was given the task to count up how many Viet Cong, how many North Vietnamese in South Vietnam were armed. Well, Sam was a terrific guy. He gets a great big table, put all the intercepts and the defector reports and the POW reports and the photography and the whole schmear, okay? And it took him 2 months, but he came up with a figure. He said there are 500 to 600,000 Vietnamese under arms in the South, communists. Now, that was a big to-do because General Westmoreland in Vietnam was saying, no, there couldn't be more than 299,000. Suspicious, 299,000? You know, you buy something for 299? Okay, well, Sam Adams wouldn't buy that for 299. He went out to Saigon and he encountered what Westmoreland was doing. That was deliberately falsifying the information. Why? Well, because the US military was saying, well, we killed 600 this week, 700 next week, 8. Now, the press in Saigon was not very bright, but they could do arithmetic, okay? And it wouldn't do for the US command in Saigon to say, oops, well, we think there are 500, 600,000 Vietnamese under arms in the South. So Westmoreland lied. Generals do that. They continue to do that. And it's our job to expose them when we can. That's what Sam Adams did, okay? Every agency in the government, except the Army, Westmoreland, agreed on the 500 to 600,000 figure. Now, here's a little personal story. I'm having lunch with Sam Adams. And I said, Sam, I don't understand. Usually when a general's running a war, he likes to exaggerate the number of enemy, not minimize it. What's going on? And so Sam says, look, it's all corrupt. They don't want to be embarrassed in Saigon. As a matter of fact, Ray, says Sam, a cable came in just this morning from General Abrams, Westmoreland's deputy. And 8 of them said, and I know the cable by heart, we can't, quote, we can't possibly go with the 500 to 600,000 figures because we have been projecting a image of success in this war. And no matter how many caveats or explanations we could adduce to explain that it's now 500, 600,000, this would not prevent the press from drawing an erroneous and gloomy conclusion. End quote. God, why do I mention that? Well, not only because there it is in black and white, I had a chance then to see if Sam could wangle a copy of that cable. And I could take it down to the New York Times bureau in Washington and say, look, this kind of fraud. This was August 1967, before the Tet Offensive, where the magnification of numbers proved Sam correct. I could have taken it down to the New York Times bureau. Now, people might say, well, come on, New York Times. In those days, get this now, in those days, if you had documentary evidence, the New York Times likely is not would put it on their front page. They didn't, in those days, ask for permission from the CIA or the White House, which is exactly what they do today, okay? So, do I regret not even asking Sam? Well, it would have been a stretch for Sam to get a copy. He probably wouldn't have done it, but I regret not having tried, you know? Here it is, very early in the war, not having tried. Anyhow, that was the experience of Vietnam. Now, when it came to writing up the number of enemy communists under arms in the South, we did a national intelligence estimate. That involves all the agencies of the US government involved in intelligence, 12 at the time, okay? And the estimate said, Sam is right, these are the numbers. And our leader, Dick Helms, the director of CIA, said, are you sure? We said, not only are we sure, everybody else agrees except the Army for obvious reasons. They can't disagree with Westmoreland. And you know what Helms said? He said, well, you know, my primary job is to protect the CIA. So I'm going to go with Westmoreland's numbers because there's no point in getting involved in a pissing match with the US Army at war. Coming back from that meeting, one of the muckety-mucks that ran estimates had the audacity to say to Sam Adams in my presence, Sam, do you think we've gone beyond the range of reasonable dishonesty? And Sam's gonna hit him in the head. I prevented that at least. But Sam met an untimely end. He was dismissed from the agency and he actually died of an early heart attack. Anyhow, that was part of the experience of how leadership really can determine how well an agency functions. Now, let me just go a little farther here and talk a little about leadership. Under Ronald Reagan, when he came in 1981, he appointed Bill Casey to be the director of the CIA. Casey was a real cold warrior. He ran spies against the Nazis, and the Russians were worse than the Nazis, right? The first thing he said is, you know, I hear from Al Haig, who was briefly Secretary of State, I hear from him that the Russians are behind all the terrorists in the world. Do me a memo on that. We did. We came to a different conclusion. He had somebody else, some other agency, in that case, the Defense Intelligence Agency, write that memo, okay? So Casey literally saw 3 Soviets under every rock. Now, Bob Gates, who actually worked for me, worked for me in the 70s and was one of the people I had in the SALT negotiating rotation. He went to Mr. Casey and he says, Mr. Casey, I see 5 Soviets there. You only see 3, there are 5 there. This is all metaphorical, right? But not very different from what the situation was in Nicaragua. Well, suffice it to say that Bobby Gates became all of a sudden 3 grades higher, the head of analysis, and he did exactly what Casey wanted him to do. I guess I'll fast forward now. I was able during those same years, that is 1981 to 1985, I briefed Ronald Reagan's most senior national security officials, as Will has already said. We used to brief Reagan, but that was when he was the candidate, when he was the nominee. He got a special briefing. We just forced ourselves past the Secret Service. We need to give the president CIA briefing, and it worked. Okay. Then when he got into town after the inaugural, Vice President H.W. Bush went up to the president and said, "Now, how are you going to handle these briefings? You know, I know you've been getting this personal treatment. I'd like to get the same treatment, and maybe the Secretary of State, So how do you want to handle this?" And Reagan said, "Well, now that we're here, how about you all get briefed in early morning, and then why don't you come to see me about 11:30 and tell me what I should know?" So Reagan wanted to sleep in. More power to him. He needed that sleep. So we were in the position of briefing all his most senior advisors. There'd be a team of 2 on any given national security advisor, the vice president, secretary of state, secretary of defense, and later, at our request, Reagan approved the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman to be briefed. That was real heavy duty. It was wonderful duty because at that particular time, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to become head of the Soviet Union. Now, little vignette. During this time, we were being asked, well, is Gorbachev the real deal? I mean, he sounds pretty liberal. I mean, he's allowing criticism of the Communist Party on the front page of Pravda, for God's sake. He's got this open glasnost and perestroika. And of course, Casey and Gates said, no, he's a commie. He's a commie, for God's sake. What's a commie? Always a commie. The Russian Communist Party will never give up power peaceably. That's what they told Reagan. That's what they told Schultz. That's what they told everybody. But I wasn't going to follow that, you know. So I would wait to be asked. But I remember one time I was in Schultz's office. He was a good guy, Schultz, really smart and level-headed. So I bought him a little ticker. That's what we used to call it, coming off the teletype machine. You were invited to Moscow to meet with Gorbachev. And he looks at me. I suppose your supervisors would say this is a terrible idea. Moment of truth for McGovern. Secretary Schultz, you know I don't always agree with my supervisors. He went, all right, not just because I said it was a good idea. And you know the rest of it, there was a real thought, real détente. It worked really well. But let's go a little farther than that and just say, well, let's go into retirement. When I saw that my former colleagues were manufacturing evidence to justify a war of aggression, it doesn't get any worse than that. Okay, it does not get any worse than that. And there were a few hardy souls who thought the same thing, and we formed veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity to warn the president. Well, we knew what Cheney was doing. We had to give the president the benefit of the doubt. Who else do you appeal to? So we wrote a memo, just as we used to do when we were on active duty, so to speak. And we told Mr. President, we listened to Colin Powell at the UN this morning. We need to tell you that we gave him an A for performance and a C- for content. There's no reason to start a war with Iraq. And unless you widen the circle of your advisors beyond those clearly bent on an unnecessary war, the results are going to be catastrophic. All words. We take no pleasure in the fact that that happened to be true. We warned about it, 2.5 months in advance. We had 2 more memos we gave to the president. They didn't listen. So this was a bitter pill to swallow because they were our colleagues, and there was nobody who spoke up. There were hundreds of them that knew what the game was. None of them spoke up. And, we lost a lot of friends by criticizing them after the fact. I mean, there are lots of people who say, well, you gotta get with the program. Now, I'd like to just single out one particular person because he's, I think he's a CNN pundit now. His name is James Clapper. Now, he was the head of the whole shebang here, the whole head of national intelligence, including all the intelligence agencies of the US government, of which I think there are about 18 and 19 now, okay? They're growing like Topsy. So what about him? Well, he was an Air Force general. And when Rumsfeld came in with Bush and Cheney, he wanted somebody reliable to take care of imagery analysis. Imagery, all the stuff you get from not only photos, but all manner of imagery. You wouldn't believe what we learned from all those satellites, okay? He wanted somebody in place there to make sure that they control the imagery analysis, okay? Why? Well, because they wanted to make up weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Clapper saluted, and he's so naive. He wrote a book, okay, a memoir, and in his book he places the blame on the administration and on Cheney for being so strong on wanting to find weapons of mass destruction. And this is what he says, and I quote, "The blame needs to be squarely on the shoulders of administration members who are pushing a narrative that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and on the intelligence officers, including me, who were so eager to help that we found what wasn't really there." I repeat that last part. We're so eager to help that we found what wasn't really there. Give me a break. What a, I got lots of adjectives, but this is the guy, in charge of all the agencies put in there by friends like Bobby Gates and Donald Rumsfeld. Now, the media was an accomplice in all this. The media was banging on the drums for war on Iraq. I couldn't, up to the last minute, I say to myself, McGovern, they've got 300,000 men there. You got to believe that they're going to, would the United States of America create a war of aggression? I mean, I remember Nuremberg, right? The definition of a war of aggression, the supreme international crime differing from other war crimes only insofar as it contains the accumulated evil of the whole. Think kidnapping, think torture, think all those other things that the CIA and others were involved in. I couldn't conceive. Well, they did it, right? Okay. Now, Clapper was just one person there. I got carried away and I threw away my notes here, but What I want to say here is that the media was such an accomplice in all this. And as a result, during the election campaign of 2016, Russiagate started to take hold. Now, I was at an early meeting at Hillary Clinton and John Podesta's old think tank, January of 2017, right after Trump took over. And they were already saying, aha, the Russians, Trump is in bed with the Russians, Trump, yeah, the Russians are hacked. The Russians hacked the DNC. Why did they hack the Democratic National Committee? So that they could help Hillary lose and help Trump. I don't like to say the name actually, win. Now, we analysts have to be apolitical. Really and truly, we have to look things not in a nonpartisan way. But in deference to my wife, who insists that I say this in every such lecture, Ray, tell them what you think of Donald Trump. For God's sake, they'll get the wrong impression. And what I think of Donald Trump, and what I've been saying for 4 years, 5 years now, is that he is the very worst president the United States ever had. And that was before January 6th. That was before all this other stuff, okay? But that doesn't mean that they weren't out to get him, okay? Now, I had this early experience with Adam Schiff, who was the House Intelligence Chairman, Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. I went to Hillary Clinton and John Podesta's old think tank, and I encountered him there. And I had worn out my welcome in weeks previous, so that I wasn't acknowledged when I wanted to ask a question. That's what I always do. So I went up afterwards. I didn't know that the camera was still on. I didn't know that the microphone was still on, but somebody caught it. And here's 2 minutes worth of my little discussion with Schiff, the end of January 2017.
Schiff, my name is Ray McGovern. I served in CIA under 7 presidents and 9 directors.
Well, thank you very much.
We have a little alumni group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and we've been following this issue very closely. One of our members is the former technical director of NSA. I'm interested in 1 week ago, when the president said this, I don't want to misquote him, the conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to Russian hacking were not conclusive regarding WikiLeaks. In other words, there's a big gap between alleged Russian hacking and WikiLeaks. The intelligence community does not know how or if that information, to the degree it exists, got to WikiLeaks. Now, you assert as flat fact that Russia did this. Do you know more than Obama?
Well, I would never claim to know more than Obama. I think he's a brilliant man.
It's a very serious question.
No, it's a serious question. I have every confidence in the intelligence of the Russian hacking of both the DNC as well as John Podesta.
James Clapper is a convicted...
You asked me a question. Do you want to hear the answer?
I will.
While I can't go into the classified information, I have every confidence that the Russians used WikiLeaks, whether Julian Assange was a knowing participant or, as the Russians would describe, a useful idiot. That we will hopefully find out, but I don't have any question in the conclusions that the intelligence community.
You have every confidence but no evidence, is that right?
No, I can't share the evidence with you.
Yeah.
Congressman,
I'm
Paul
that's
Joy,
bogus.
I'm former
That's bogus.
Director of Security Senate Intelligence Committee. We always refer to it as the SSCI, the intelligence community who used SISI.
Well, that was bogus. Can you hear me now? Yeah. I mean, I can't share it with you. Well, you know what Schiff is doing there is using what I now call the Giuliani dictum. Why Giuliani? Well, he was mayor of New York, but more recently he was one of Trump's lawyers, right? Well, when he called the head of the Arizona House of Representatives and said, "Oh, we have all kinds of massive fraud. There's all kinds of massive fraud in Arizona. You got to look into it." The chief of the head of the head of the house there in Arizona said, "Well, my God, sure, we'll look into it. What's your evidence?" Get this now. This is the Giuliani dictum. He said, "Oh, we have a lot of theories, but no evidence." Okay. So he said that. Okay. So we said that to lots of people. So there is no evidence. They make it up. And political season is very, very ripe to do this. May we have the first slide, Will? You know, in the same vein as what I just quoted from Giuliani, I'll start with the number 2 there, Will Rogers quip. Now, Will Rogers, you all probably don't know, he way back even before my time, but he was a humorist, and he had a pronounced truth that he said, and this was what he said. You know what the problem is? The problem ain't what people know. It's what people know that ain't so. That's the problem. Now, I ask you, how many of your friends are convinced that the Russians hacked the Democratic National Committee headquarters in order to get Trump in place and make Hillary be defeated, and that Trump was cavorting with the Russians? Well, don't have to raise your hands now. Let's go through this slide. Robbie Mook, who's he? Well, he was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. What did he say? Well, under oath, he said, well, Hillary approved the cockamamie story about Trump's people being in touch with the Alpha Bank in Russia. That was before the election, right? It was all contrived, made out of whole cloth. The techies who were asked to do the evidence say, yeah, this will never stand up. They won't stand up more than a week. That's all right. We got a week before the election, okay? Now, what about the Clapper and Jay Johnson? Well, here's Clapper again. In October, so it was right before the election, 2016. In October, Obama said, look, we need to get that evidence on the Russian hacking, okay? We got to make sure that those WikiLeaks things we got to pin it on the Russians. And Clapper and Johnson said, yeah, but the cyber firm that the FBI deferred to look into the hack of the DNC computers, it hasn't reported yet. We have to wait. No, don't wait. Just accuse them. Obama. How do we know that? It's in emails that came out with connection to one of these court cases, okay? They did it anyway. Now, Jay Johnson, what I remember about him is his wife is a Catholic. And when he was mulling over whether he should have approved so many civilians or so many people not known to be civilians or military to be killed by drone strikes, he said, and I quote, "I sure glad I'm not a Catholic because I have to go to confession about this," end quote. So they did it anyway. They gave Obama and Hillary Clinton false evidence that there was a Russian hack. Let's see the next slide, if you would. Oh, who's this Sean Henry? Well, actually, he was a technical guy, and he worked for Bob Mueller, the fellow who launched that long investigation about Russiagate, okay? Now, Mueller started that in the spring of 2017. On the 5th of December, Sean Henry, the head of CrowdStrike, testified under oath. And what did he say? He said, oh, we have no technical evidence that the Russians or anybody else hacked into the DNC computers. I want to repeat that again. Sean Henry, quizzed by all these House Intelligence Committee members, said there is no technical evidence that Russia or any other entity hacked into the DNC computers. Whoa, when was that? That was December 5th, 2017. I didn't know about that. I wonder if Sean Henry told his old boss, Bob Mueller. Mueller prolonged his investigation so that it would get past the midterms so the Democrats would win back the House, which of course they did. Didn't he know that it was all, that there was no Russian hack? Well, the guy who worked for him for 12 years as his chief techie knew. Didn't Sean Henry think to tell Bob Mueller? Oh, those are questions you might mull over in your own mind. In any case, so we have the testimony. It's not classified. It's just committee sensitive. So what does Adam Schiff, my friend that I just had a little encounter with, what does he do? He puts it in the bottom of his pile. He deep sixes it. For how long? Well, Trump finally got wise to the fact that this should be out, and he appointed a new national intelligence director. And the national intelligence director said, hey, that testimony from Sean Henry that says there was no Russian hack, you gotta release that. And Schiff said, no. And okay, you don't release it, I'm gonna release it tomorrow. So Schiff releases it. When? May 7th. What's the difference between May 7th and December 5th of 2017? I'll tell you, 29 months. That's how long Schiff was able to hide that testimony. Now, this is important testimony. People still believe that most people still believe that the Russians hacked into the DNC, right? Okay, now, I remember at the time, as soon as I saw this, and it was published, not widely, in other words, the testimony was published and we have the URL. I remember saying on some interviews at the time, I wonder how long the New York Times will take before it publishes Sean Henry's testimony, since it cuts across the grain of everything the New York Times and the Washington Post have been saying for the last 2.5 years. Well, guess what? And we have the next slide, please. Okay, they ignored it. Now, what's this? This is October 2022. How many months since it was made available has the New York Times ignored it? Would you believe 29 months plus 2 weeks? So I thought I was kidding when I said, the New York Times is, hardly be able to match Schiff with that 2.5 year deep sixing, but they did. Have you seen it in the Times, the Post yet? No. So they're going for a new record, and no one will know that this was all made out of whole cloth. So major media, they ignore things. They're pretty much in the throes of the government. The New York Times for a long time now has not published anything sensitive without asking for approval from the White House. A terrible thing. We used to live with the New York Times in New York as our Bible, no more. So you do the arithmetic, 29 months between the testimony and its release, now 29 months plus. And here's the PDF, here's the testimony. You ought to read it. Copy it down if you will, or Will can save it for you. It's amazing. So it's still available. Contact your local newspaper and tell them, hey, I got some news for you. It's a real breaking news, you could say, publish it. You know, it's not funny, but you have to keep your sense of humor, and you have to keep at it. And how will I close here? I'll just say that you know, the CIA, which we really started with as an institution, it had two heads originally. It was a great fault to see that there were two agencies where there should have been just one. My recommendation now, when we see that the analysts, I used to say, let me put it this way, I used to say, hey, the analysis is really important. There is some chance they can do objective analysis still. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's just address the divide here and let the operators go to the Pentagon or where they want to go. They can hide out there, they can do their thing, and they won't affect the analysis. But now, guess what? John Brennan put them all together. So you got the analysts sitting next to the operators. If the operators come up with some cockamamie idea like overthrowing the government in wherever, what's the analyst going to say? Is he going to say, well, that doesn't make any sense? No, they're all in it together. So you should abolish the CIA. I hate to say it, you know, but it's been 75 years. Part of it made a contribution, as I mentioned, with respect to the SALT agreements and negotiations. But, you know, the accumulated evil has sort of taken it over. And the people who have been promoted were promoted initially under Casey and Gates. And they're the same people that fudged the evidence, leading to a war of aggression, the supreme international crime. So it pains me to say that, but we ought to get rid of it. We ought to figure out some other way to have an analysis shop that is not beholden to the State Department or the Pentagon, that can do objective analysis. Let the fellows who overthrow governments go ahead and do that, but on their own. Really happy to hear any questions that you have, and thanks for inviting me again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ray. That was great. At this point, we'll take any questions. So I have the Zoom set up so that I have to unmute you. So if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can put that question in the chat. Raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or in the chat. Okay, got a question.
Hi, my name is Leia. I plan to do some internships at the CIA for Asian studies. I'm currently learning Chinese. Do you suggest any other languages I should learn to be more qualified for?
Did you say you have Chinese?
Yes, I'm learning Chinese right now.
Terrific. Yeah, well, that's biggie, of course. Well, Japanese, of course, learning both would be quite a onerous task, but I would suggest you simply focus in on the Chinese until you really are native in it. And then if you can handle Japanese, Indonesian is a lot easier. Which Chinese are you studying, Mandarin or Cantonese?
Mandarin.
No, good. Okay. Well, you could learn Cantonese as well. Those are my suggestions. Yeah, and when you go there, this would be a summer job, would it be?
Yes.
Yeah, I would just kind of look around and find out what you can about what kind of place it is now. I've been away for far too long. And you know, when people ask me, is this a good place to work? I would have to say, well, do you have integrity? And he always say, oh, yeah. And I say, do you have courage? And I think so. And I said, of course, go work there. We need people with integrity and with courage. And if they're asked to do things that aren't right, or if they're asked to shave the evidence or concoct it or manufacture it, then you're young, you've got courage, you go somewhere else, you quit. But don't shy away from getting into these fields, because at their best, they're very heady and they're very valuable.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Oops. Priyanka.
Hey, name's Priyanka, I guess, like you said. I know you said this was a necessary evil that should be abolished, but there's like a lot of things that we're just so much dependent on, like as in like with the US government, like there's just things, that systems that we just need. Do you think it was more of like we should just take the operative system out of CIA, or like just create a whole new branch for them?
Well, I think that as embarrassing as it was back in 1947 to have created a agency for overthrowing governments, they should have done so. They could call it something else, all right? But you don't put them in with the analysts, okay? Now, having the two together is the real original sin. If you can create an analysis group, maybe, well, I hate to say under the State Department, because that's, you get having to repeat State Department policy. It needs to be independent. It needs to be under the president, but the president needs to be strong enough to say, look, I wanted you to tell me like it is. That's what Truman wanted. He wanted untreated intelligence. That's what he meant. And if a president doesn't realize how valuable that is, if a president doesn't understand that he needs objective analysis, so much the worse for that president. The system should allow that. And how you create it is, anybody's business. But right now, it doesn't seem like people are wise enough to realize that the system is kind of defunct and has been sort of ruined by careerists and by ideologues and by people who are willing to play along to get along. And I'm really sorry to have to say that, because that includes some of my friends.
Next up, we have Jeremy.
I think you can hear me.
Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks
Good.
for the talk. I appreciate it. I'm a professor in peace and conflict studies here at UNCG, and long had an interest in CIA and the history of it a bit. And I was curious, like some of the conversation and some of the things that you said in terms of reacting to interests of parties like the president or the head of the CIA or others. And, you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis early on, and I was thinking about, well, there was another time in history we came pretty close. I just read a book about Bangladesh and the creation of Bangladesh and how we were on really almost as close at that point with our nuclear cruisers standing with the standoff between the Russians and the Americans that we've never really even heard about. I was oblivious to this history. And in that case, part of the history of Bangladesh and the creation of from East Pakistan to Bangladesh, the President Nixon was trying to make relationships with Mao and create his trip to China, and it was Yahya Khan who was doing that bidding for him. So he was unwilling to kind of step in and stop things, and it just escalated and got very close. And so I think it's just another example, of the way that interests of the parties sometimes get in the way. And when you're an analyst or an operative for the CIA and you've got this intelligence that's going against that interest, how do you convince that interest of that? I mean, or take Bush as the example with the Iraq War, right? And a real interest to go in and do this regardless of what the intelligence said. I mean, there's a moral kind of call, and it sounds like you tried to stand up at times unsuccessfully, right? In the video clip you played, I appreciate that, even standing up against the Democrats as well, because they'll make spurious arguments as well and use false intelligence. So I'm just curious, like what would you recommend to some of our students who are thinking? I mean, I was listening to one of the students talking about wanting to go and work for the CIA, and how you mentioned quitting, but short of quitting and leaving, what do you do when those interests don't, when you can't persuade a Bush to like, well, no, don't go fight your dad's war again, right?
Yeah, well, it's Jeremy. It's a good question, and there's no easy answer. You hang in as long as you can. I mean, you can affect policy by telling the truth, not under every president, and not when a president wants to do something like attack a nation like Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya. So there's a limit to what intelligence can do. The idea is to serve up unadulterated facts and interpretation without bias, so the president can make good decisions. Right now, there's a real premium on that. Today and tomorrow, as I was mentioning before, are the exact 60th anniversary where John Kennedy sent this final ultimatum to Khrushchev saying, I need an answer by the end of the day tomorrow as to whether you're going to pull out those missiles, okay? If you pull them out, I'll promise not to invade Cuba, okay? Now, 60 years ago tomorrow, Khrushchev replied and he said, I appreciate your concern for peace. I will be pulling out those missiles. We'll wrap them up, we'll crate them, and we appreciate your undertaking not to invade Cuba. Now, that took a lot of guts. What were the stakes there? Well, the stakes were simply that the Russians had already put into Cuba medium-range ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads capable of hitting not only Washington, D.C., but SAC headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska. How long would it take from launch to target? Mere minutes. I can't get a straight answer from anybody right now, but mere minutes. So what was the problem? Existential threat, as President Kennedy saw it. This would reverse the balance of power here. It would give the Russians minutes to threaten, okay? So what do? They did illegal things. Blockade is illegal, right? Assembling forces to invade Cuba is illegal. Threatening nuclear war, you're not supposed to do that under the UN, you know? But he did it. Why? Because that's what you do when you're a great power and you have a nuclear potential and you can make good your word, okay? That's what you do with an existential threat. Now, as I mentioned before, I did this article today. I compare it with Ukraine, okay? People don't know that there are emplacements that can accommodate medium-range ballistic missiles already in Poland on Russia's periphery and in Romania. On the 30th of December, President Biden promised Putin not to put them in Ukraine. Guess what? He was overruled. The negotiations that started 9 days later, no, the new U.S. negotiators didn't know anything about this promise. They didn't want to talk about it, okay? So 6 weeks later, on the 12th of February, Putin talks to Biden again. So what about that promise? Well, the readout we have is it wasn't mentioned. It's not on the agenda. It wasn't mentioned. So that's 2 weeks before he invaded Ukraine. People say to me, how can you excuse what he did? I don't excuse it. Then what? I try to understand it. If you don't understand your adversary, you're in trouble deep, okay? He saw an existential threat, okay? Not only from these missiles, but also from the neo-Nazis in Ukraine and some of the other things that were going on there against the Russian-speaking people. So the way I reconstruct it, as seeing a reneging, as he saw it, on the part of Biden, seeing full backing on the part of Xi Jinping, whom he visited in Beijing early in February, he said, well, the only thing left for me to do is clean this thing out. Now, am I sorry about that? Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. But if Putin's prime duty, like John Kennedy's back 60 years ago, was to create a safe space for his country so it would not be under immediate threat of being blown to smithereens, then just as nobody accused Kennedy of being unprovoked, my God, he was provoked up the kazoo, all right? All kinds of missiles and nuclear warheads in Cuba. Well, people are complaining that this Ukraine invasion was unprovoked. Well, that's not the way I see it. And if we deny how many times Putin was provoked on this, then we're just dealing in the unreality, which, most important of all, doesn't make it possible for us to figure out how to get out of this thing. In other words, how do we get out? Well, Khrushchev backed down. Who's going to back down this time? Not Putin. It's an existential threat to Putin. Is Ukraine an existential threat to the United States? Well, if you think that, I'd really like you to explain that to me, okay? So this is what I deal with in this article that's fresh in my mind. It matters, it matters whether people lie or people make undertakings that they just are overruled. Think about Putin. Biden makes this promise the day before New Year's Eve. All of a sudden, it evaporates into thin air. Who's in charge there in Washington? Who's calling the shots? Is it these sophomores like Sullivan and Blinken? Is it the military? With that kind of uncertainty, I would hate to be the head of Russia because, it's bad enough at not knowing who's in control, but not knowing what the next step is still worse.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question, Ray, and I think we'll make my question the last one. I'd kind of like to echo what Jeremy asked, and just kind of like you were just discussing, it feels like we're almost closer to nuclear war than at any point that we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis right now. And as folks sitting in Greensboro, North Carolina, it feels pretty powerless. Is there anything that we can do as average people to help stop what's going on?
Well, thanks, Will. I think the most important thing is to be able to be informed and then, by extension, inform others. There are elections coming up. There is ample opportunity to go to your representatives or your senators and say, look, why are you pouring still more money into Ukraine when, it looks like NATO and the US are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian? Why don't you talk? 30 US Democratic representatives 2 days ago said, really it'd be a good idea if Biden and Putin would talk. That's exactly how the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved. Guess what? After just 7 hours, they had to retract that. They said, oh, no, we didn't mean that. No, we mean you give them more arms, okay? Well, I don't know how to figure that. All I know is that there is an interest here. There is a cui bono, who this really favors or who this profits. And it's something I've coined. Eisenhower, and this is really basic stuff, you may know it. Eisenhower coined the expression, the military-industrial complex. That was his farewell address. He said, look, this complex is bigger than I ever expected. It's very powerful. You have to guard against the accretion of still more power because it will vitiate your democracy, okay? Those were his last words. Now, who better than a general would know that, okay? Now, he added one thing. He said the only protection against this would be a well-educated populace. Ooh. Well, I showed that one little case study about Russian hacking that we don't have a well-educated populace. What we do have is something that expands from the military industrial complex. Some people call it the MIC, the MIC. And those of you who have a pencil, this is on the final exam. People smiling. All right, here it is, the Mickey Mat. It rhymes in a little bit with Mickey Mouse. That's how you might remember it, okay? The Mickey Mat, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Now, why did I say media as in all caps? Because media is the linchpin. The media is controlled by the rest of the Mickey Mat. The corporations that control the media profiteer on these wars. Nobody's doing any better than Raytheon right now, creating or building all these missiles and so forth. So there are people getting very, very rich, okay? What did I see the other day? So the head of Apple is getting something like 1,500 times more pay than the normal worker at Apple. This is unjust, okay? And let me throw in just because I am who I am, I'm a progressive Catholic, and what I believe is what we Catholics call the preferential option for the poor. It's related to the Mickey Mat, because as strong as the Mickey Mat is, you don't get any real deal for the poor. So the preferential option for the poor was spelled out by the Catholic bishops a half century ago. It goes like this: no one is entitled to accumulate still more of what he or she doesn't need when others remain without the basic necessities of life. End quote. Now, where are we here in this country when CEOs are making 1,500 times as much as the normal worker, not the carpool, not the pool, the normal worker? I mean, we've got to stand up to these folks. And, you know, if you have the courage of your convictions, you need to put your body into it. Now, I don't know if there are any people with this color hair watching, but it's a real advantage to have this color hair, and I'll explain. Because, you know, people in America, they don't usually, well, you know, when young people get beat up, you know, the attitude is, well, they got to come to them. Look what they're doing. I don't. But when the old people get beat up, like me, you know, and I've had this experience several times and ended up in prison several times. People don't like that. Americans don't like that. All right. So if you know some people who are enlightened and willing to stick their necks out, go with them, and you know, kind of let them put into play this great advantage that we have. It works, folks. In other words, we are at such a pass that one does have to put one's body into it. And you know, the last thing I'll say is that, you know, we can't get into the major media. Now, this is a free country. Used to be anyway. I can't, you know, we keep pulling our hair out. Why can't we get into the major media? Well, I kind of think that the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Are we not imaginative enough? Are we not clever enough? Are we not courageous enough to push our way into the public consciousness? I think we have to be. And this business about, you know, just, oh, we can't get in the media. Well, it reminds me of the Noah principle, and I'll conclude with that. The Noah, you know, like in the Bible, Noah principle. The Noah principle is this: no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arks. Get it? We got to figure out how to build some arks. There are enough of us. You know, my favorite theologian, Annie Dillard, always says, you know, don't be deceived to say there are not enough of us. There are enough of us. But as Cesar Chavez used to say, without action, nothing's going to happen. Thanks for the question there, Will, because that comes to the nub of the thing. It's really incumbent upon us to go ahead and figure out how we bring ourselves into the public consciousness and how we embarrass, how we shame. These people are making hand over fist out of wars. You know, they should be held to account. And, you know, we still can. I'd suggest that we figure out ways to do that. Best way, in my view, is to form little groups, you know, 3 or 4 people, make sure there's a woman in these groups because they have all the guts these days, and figure out, after you get to know each other real well, what you could do either as a body or in support of each one individually. That's how it works. This kind of mutual support is what you need. And I wish you all luck. And Will, I thank you again for inviting me onto your class.
Thank you so much, Ray. I can't think of a better way to end it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ray, for joining us. And that's it for tonight.
Bye now.
Bye, Ray.